You must encounter young people who are on the brink of maybe keeping or losing faith. How do you counsel people in a situation like that?
It's not my job to save a student.
I'm so excited to be here with Lindsey Hankins, who is a theologian, author, speaker. She has a forthcoming book that she's working on right now about Thomas Aquinas and women and prayer. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thanks for having me.
To talk about theology and whatever it is that we talk about. Let me ask you this. Why do you believe in God?
I believe in God because I encountered him. I think I grew up in a really great family. We weren't necessarily churchgoers. I thought it only happened during the school year. And then I met a group of girls who were going to something called Young Life, and we went to this barn in high school where they started talking about Jesus, and it just sounded true and really beautiful.
Isn't it kind of funny that these encounters with God often for young people or a lot of people happen in these odd environments, like a barn
100%.
Or a field, or like I was in a weird youth group in a basement somewhere.
Yes.
Why is it always like that?
I think because at least at that point in our lives, we were still doing weird stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if my students do. I don't know if they get out of their houses, do that kind of stuff. But I just think it's the kind of places where ministry happen, right? Like, is that you're just trying to get a group of people together at that age who kind of galvanizing the movement of the relationships that they have with each other. And I'm really grateful for it. Like I learned a lot about Christian community in a good way from this ministry that was like pretty eclectic and pretty basic in the best possible way, right? Like there were no frills to it.
Yeah. You teach a lot of freshmen at the university.
I teach a lot of freshmen.
A lot of freshmen, just basic intro to theology kind of stuff and Christian history. A lot of people have observed a trend in young people today, which is that a lot of them have not had what we might call, in a fancy term, catechesis, a kind of teaching that prepares one to actually accept faith and get baptized. How do you go about a task like that in a mixed group? Some people who come from very deep church backgrounds and other people who don't, but are open to exploring. Like, what do you do? How do you even start something like that?
Well, to be frank, I think it's a pretty rare bird in our college and in that, especially that introductory course in the Bible. It's a really rare bird who's actually read the whole Bible. There's a lot of students who might say they know the Bible a lot, but if you start to dig a little bit, what they mean is that they read the parts of the New Testament quite a bit.
Sure.
So it's less of a divide than you might, or less of a spread than you might think.
Oh, I see. So you're saying even the
delta between those
even the
who have
church kids, even the church kids maybe haven't had that kind of training.
They've encountered stories. There's very rare exceptions, but they have a very low ability to chart the story, to give any sense of like why Abraham relates to Isaac, relates to Jacob, relates to like the narrative arc of Scripture as a whole is pretty mysterious. And so that delta between students who've like, am I holding it the right way? And then students who are like, I went to all these Christian schools. And this is not me poo-pooing the Christian schools around the area that are doing really good, fine work. And yet, I just think that the kind of dedicated attention to the Bible as its own literary artifact, cultural artifact, every student in the room encounters something they did not hear before, despite it being an introductory course.
Yeah. Do you think that this is a developmental thing? Like this is just where an 18-year-old in college is going to be at? Or do you think there's something going on culturally or in our churches where we're just not able to do that kind of teaching or foundation that maybe we imagined happened 50 years ago or something?
Well, I think it's pretty demonstrably charted, right? That like biblical literacy is at an all-time low. So that's not like a hot take, right? Like people know less about the Bible, are reading the Bible way less than historically we may have. Which is to say that we don't have like these common narratives, these common stories, these common characters who just live in our brains. So when I say Job to a student, they don't immediately have this like flash forward to like this cataclysmic experience with the Lord and loss and existential crisis that comes along with that character. But your question was more about like the loss of catechesis.
Take it whatever direction you want.
I
guess I'm curious about one thing I'm noticing about universities in the United States right now, particularly Christian universities, is that we're starting to realize that we play a serious role in teaching students basic things about the faith.
Yeah.
And in a way, that was a role that maybe in the past had been provided by families or by churches. And now universities are taking this on, particularly, and I guess I'm speaking, from within a Christian university with you, we're colleagues, about that role. And I'm just interested in that cultural dynamic.
Well, again, you don't have to go too far into the Pew Research like bubble or like that cauldron, right, to figure out that church attendance is dropping away. Church membership is getting lower and lower in these like mainline denominations, particularly Protestant. So I think it doesn't take long for the discipleship pipeline to fall apart. And so if parents have stopped going to church, if they've stopped narrating the stories of Scripture, if they've stopped praying with their kids at night, then, I mean, like that takes a generation, right? And before that sort of ends by the next time that kid has a kid. So I think we're attending church less often. Churches are typically doing less catechetical work themselves, right? We do youth programs, but they're more maybe relationally oriented and less sort of like, here's what the Lord's Prayer is, or here's how the Sermon on the Mount relates to the rest of Scripture or whatnot. I just think we can't be totally surprised at the results when students walk in overwhelmingly interested in hearing more about God, having a like beginner's faith or earnest faith without a whole lot of content behind it.
Sure.
We can't be totally surprised by that when I think the opportunities for challenge, for education, for growth are not as available as I think they were. Even maybe, do we get to say our generation? Is like, how do you talk about that? Like our generation? I mean, in my early 40s.
We're old enough now. You can say it.
I think there were safe assumptions made when I was in high school going into college that even if you hadn't grown up in a Christian home, you knew who Adam and Eve were.
Right.
You knew who Job was. You knew who Abraham was. Like
Sure.
that there would be, you certainly knew who Jesus was. I don't think that's a safe assumption for me as an educator with the students I encounter as freshmen.
Now you're talking even just about the basic biblical storyline and characters, but then there's also this like story of Christian history after the Bible and theology, and that's another mountain to climb.
That's an entirely different, and I would say even more cloaked in mystery.
Wow.
Right? Like that's not something, especially if you went to a public school, right? Where would you have access to that?
Mm-hmm. I presume that as you came to faith and as you worked in churches and parachurch ministries, there's that side of your identity. But then there's also this academic side. You have a PhD in theology from Princeton Seminary. Like, how did you get into the academic side of things? Why did that appeal to you, do you think?
I know I'm a good enough theologian to know this isn't accurate, but it definitely feels like I fell backwards into it the sense that
what does that mean?
I had planned on going into medicine. And so I had,
Oh, really?
I was, calc chem biophysics, nothing else for a couple years. And then I had become a Christian later on in life. And so so I realized one day that I had all these Christian friends who talked about praying about their jobs and their vocations, and I had never done that. And so I honestly think my prayer was something like, God, if you want me to change my career, you just have to make it super obvious, which he did in a very dramatic fashion. Like he literally audibly spoke to me, which I think it's almost like God's sense of humor. I'd rather not be spoken to that way. I'd rather have like a nice conversation with a friend or read a text and it just feel like God is leading me in some direction.
Sure.
So I applied to the only Christian school I'd ever heard of, which was in Minnesota. And so I went to this Christian school, and it was at that Christian school as a junior where I even heard the term theology for the first time.
Wow.
And was like, this is a thing.
Okay, but that speaks to the role of the Christian university to provide something like that teaching where a student would have an encounter like that. That's amazing.
All I knew is that God had called me to do something in ministry, but I had no concept of what pathways, what kinds of disciplines that could possibly entail. I had no backdrop for that. And so it wasn't until I was a junior at a Christian college, which my first year there, that I realized there was something called a discipline called theology, where I could study church history, doctrine, and then, because it's theology, literally anything, because it's God and the things of God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got into it. And then I kept sticking with it because it turns out I just had even more questions. And it turned out that tradition was so rich and so deep, and that there were places that I could go where I could be mentored by really mature Christians who were incredibly thoughtful and had not put their brains on a shelf to follow the Lord, right? Like who really thought that fidelity meant pushing and asking and diving into that mystery. And it was just thrilling.
Yeah.
So I got to just keep taking degrees.
Did you ever have something like what people call a faith crisis, during your studies? Where
I have a faith crisis every month.
Every month?
Yeah. I mean, I just think I don't know too many people who are ardently pursuing the Lord who don't experience some profound doubt. And then I think particularly as you mature in your faith, seasons of darkness and doubt. I think that's entirely natural. One of the best things about being a historical theologian is realizing that that's not new, that that's just sort of an expectation that those mature in their faith will experience darkness, will experience doubt. I mean, we have a treasure trove of examples where that is not a deviation from faith, but that's the process that faith takes. So do you know the life of Moses, Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses?
I know of Gregory of Nyssa, not the Life of Moses, though.
So
Tell me more.
Gregory of Nyssa is this early church father, Cappadocian, 4th century-ish. And he takes a lot of meaning from the life of Moses. So the book is called Life of Moses, but he sees Moses' life as in many ways this helpful chart of what the Christian life simply is, which is to say that Moses encounters God first in illumination, right? A burning bush.
Yeah.
And he thinks that this is like this image of like this kind of earth-shattering experience where suddenly you see that there is sin and it illuminates life as such. But what's his next experience, the significant experience with God? It's in a cloud, right? Like that he hears the voice of God in a cloud. There's like this movement towards a darkness. And ultimately, in his most mature experience with the Lord, he's in that cloud with him. Utterly enveloped in darkness. And Gregory calls this, he calls it a luminous darkness. And it's this idea of like, as we move in maturity to God, we are illuminated. The vision we have of God is actually one of hiddenness, not because he's moved away from us. That's not who God is, but because he's asking more of us. And I just have found that to be unendingly comforting because I've felt that.
Yeah, I find comfort in that image too. I'm also aware that there are some contexts of life and faith where that imagery would be supported and nurtured, and others where it would not be. And it's really like a hard and paradoxical road you're talking about.
There's a professional liability, right, for people who teach theology, who teach the Bible, to be on their own spiritual journeys and to be frank about that.
Yeah.
Right, to be able to say like, oh, you know what, actually this was really true for me. And I'm now wrestling with it.
Yeah.
I haven't lost faith in God. I'm not less committed to the church, to God's people, to what I believe the Lord has put before me in terms of a vocation. And yet I'm not a finished product. And so that kind of maturity to try to figure out, okay, so what's wise and true to share with students because you want to have some integrity with who you are in a classroom with who you are as such. And also this sense of like, we all need to kind of wrestle our own things, and that's not necessarily like public fodder all the time, but it feels a little different when it's when theology or the Bible are your profession.
Right. Sometimes when I've taught students, I've tried, even if I would never admit that this is what I was trying to do, I think sometimes there's just a feeling like, okay, people are paying, I'm in a classroom, I'm supposed to be smart in front of them, and there's a kind of invulnerability. Like I will pretend to be struggling or have fake questions, but really
I think about that, but you really know exactly what you want to say. I know.
And I think when I got into the field of theology and biblical studies, what I really wanted was connection with other people, but it's taken me kind of like a little too long in my life to realize that connection with other people actually occurs by vulnerability.
Yeah.
Not by strength.
Yeah.
Like, not by strength.
Zinger.
But by vulnerability.
I know.
Yeah.
And vulnerability is one of these things that's like, it's a really sexy term. Like, was it Brene Brown has like made this like a thing, and kudos to her. Great to put vulnerability back on the map. There's just so many ways to pantomime it, right? Like, oh, I'm being really vulnerable here. Sometimes I don't finish all my water and I don't recycle the can.
Yeah.
Right? There's these ways to like do kind of like a false, fake vulnerability. the vulnerability that really matters is the one that hurts, right? It's the one where you're like, a student asks an incredibly good question and it's like a blank, there's like blankness. There's nothing. And it's a genuinely shocking question. And it's shocking in like its earnestness, its goodness of like,
right.
I'm going to have to think about that. Mm-hmm. And when I say that, it means I cannot answer it now. Like you're going to need to give me a day or two. You're going to need to give me a week.
Right.
That's a little scarier to do, particularly when you've made the mistake of creating a culture in a classroom, right? Where like you are the authority.
Right.
And like the supreme authority.
Right. It also makes me think about the extreme pressures pastors are under too in those kind of situations where it's not a classroom, it's a different environment, but there's this feeling like there always must be some ready answer, and even if not an answer, some comfort or something just to offer it.
Particularly when things, this is again, not a hot take. When things are unbalanced, when things feel a little bit more frayed, when everyone's margins feel pretty thin, when the world just feels a little bit more chaotic. We all want something solid. We want something that doesn't change, something that can be trusted, something that is reliable, something that is ready to give us the authoritative word, whether that's your pastor or your professor. And I think at our most charitable, you want to offer that to folks, right? Like you want to say, no. Like there's always going to be doubt. There's always going to be mystery. And yet here are these reliable things that we can believe. That's good and true until the deep teaching has to happen, right? Where like your best pedagogical move is to lead a student deeper into the mystery and let them encounter the God who promises to not leave us alone.
Yeah.
But that takes vulnerability because I feel this need to like just tie it up in a bow. No, don't worry. Don't get too scared. Like there is an answer. We can find it together.
It's like saying, you are lost, I will save you, versus saying you are lost and I'm lost and God will save you.
Yes.
All right, lightning round, 60 seconds or less. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
What makes you believe that a soul is real?
Because it hurts.
Is God male or female?
Neither. Oh, God does not have the attributes like that we do. He's not tall. He's not round. God is God. I am.
What's the most difficult spiritual thing you've ever done in your life?
Parenthood.
Oh, true. What theological idea seems to bother students the most?
Weirdly, not weirdly because we care about people. So like the destiny of the unevangelized, but also like kind of end times things. Like end times things have had a hook that I'm surprised by. Like I thought that was more of like an 80s, 90s concern and that would be kind of petered off by now, but no.
No. I've been a little obsessed lately with thinking about the way that our faith experience gets turned into a fundamentally transactional consumer experience. Like my experience with Amazon seems to color every part of my life. How do I get out of this?
Doing things for others. like if it feels that way, then I think...
How about an answer that involves me doing less work?
Yeah, good luck. No, it's got to be the other one, right? It's got to be doing things for others.
I know one of your academic specialties in terms of even writing and thinking about Aquinas would be like what people call, affectionately, I'm sure, the Dark Ages, the medieval period. That's a period that a lot of people don't know much about and would really rather avoid and think that it never occurred. What drew you to thinking about that weird 1,000-year roughly time period between like 500 and 1500? Is that what people usually say? Like,
yeah, I think late antiquity until right before the Reformation. I'm really grateful that when I started studying theology, I began with the fathers. I somehow missed the Enlightenment turn right away. Like I began with the church fathers and basically kind of chronologically moved through my education as in my first MA, which really mattered to me because I didn't want to learn theology in abstraction. It made sense to me to hear it as a story. To hear it as like my ancestors, my family, my church, my brothers and sisters in Christ, the kinds of troubles, the kinds of joys, the kinds of questions that animated their lives based on the really unique situations of what those times and places were. So I think I actually was never really drawn to the medieval period, partly because as a broadly evangelical person studying in a broadly evangelical place, that just wasn't a strength of that community. Like typically evangelicals are not like the first to run to the medieval period.
Right.
We love the Reformation or we love the early church.
Right.
And then like we're a little suspicious about modernity.
Right.
little, maybe a lot. It wasn't until I decided that I wanted to sit, I think you become like what you spend a lot of time attending to. And so when I thought about writing my dissertation, I wanted to be really careful with the figure that I was going to spend the next 7 to 10 years learning from. And when I ended up landing on learning from Thomas Aquinas, it just forced me to get to know better the place and time that he existed in.
Yeah. Why, I mean, do you think Christians today, even evangelical Christians, should be engaging with someone like Aquinas? And if so, like, yes. Why? What would you read? How would you even start? And what would you get out of that study, do you think?
You should engage with someone like Thomas for the same reason that you should engage with someone of anyone who is worth it, who has shown themselves to not be a flash in the pan. It is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the Christian tradition of men and women who have lived exemplary lives, and not by that I mean perfect lives that are actually exemplary in like profound, massive failures and sweet joys. It's such a treat to be able to start to chart your own life against a thick backdrop of characters that do and don't share some family resemblance to your own life. And I think any education that kind of just breaks open your imagination to see like, oh, this is what faithful Christian living looks like. It doesn't have to be this one or two ways. Actually, this kind of panoply of witnesses that we have in the tradition, if you get the luxury of being able to meet them, and I genuinely think befriend them, like I have a lot of dead friends, getting to know these people has just given me such an appreciation for how wonderfully, eclectically, mysteriously God works in people's lives. And so that's freed me up to not have to feel like I have to act like someone who feels pretty not who I am.
Yeah.
So anyway, we should all study the tradition for that and a host of other reasons. Thomas Aquinas is hard as like an entree point. Augustine, who came quite a bit earlier, Augustine's like this rhetorician. He's like out to woo you as a reader. And so he's got these like gateway drug books, like the Confessions, where you really could pick it up and just suddenly be just overwhelmed by the gorgeousness of the prose. Thomas is not interested in wooing you by the beauty of his prose. It's the power of the truth of the content. Yeah. And he just wants to present that to you.
Yeah, I mean, tell me about, just to dip the toe in the water a little bit on Thomas. Like, what's the truth of some content that he gives us? Like, distill it for us. Give it to us.
Well, so Thomas wrote something called the Summa, which is his attempt to give the monastic community of which he was a part in his life, essentially a manual of like, listen, things have gotten a little wild out here. There's quite a few beliefs around things. It's gotten a little crazy. And so Thomas puts a life's work together. He was also just ridiculously productive, as some of these people are. But Thomas puts together this book, which he considers to essentially be a manual that all monks, all monastics in his order ought to read, and then they would be able to do their work well.
Yeah.
And so it's hundreds of what he would say are simply kind of like basic questions. Mm-hmm. And the way that he organizes it is, again, a little bit of a hard entree point, but it really pays off. He does this, it's called a quaestio methodology, right? Where like he raises some question that is in the ether, right? He raises some potential objections, like also things that maybe have been bandied about of like why we ought not believe this thing. Mm-hmm. And then he gives a very clear consensus, like, but this is the way it is, and just fleshes out an answer and then responds to those objections, which feels, when you read it the first few times, needlessly wordy and like needlessly complex until you start to realize that he's modeling to you what a really lively conversation looks like. Like when you are really having a great back and forth with someone, it's not because they just go like this the whole time, right? It's like they go, no, but what about this?
Yeah.
And you go, I thought you'd bring that up. Yeah, and you kind of go back and forth. Not only is he modeling that that's what good conversation looks like and good theological conversation looks like, But the actual people that he chooses to keep in his company as authoritative figures are not just the Bible, though the Bible looms very large. It's not just Augustine. It's a bunch of these pagans, like so-called pagans, right? Like Aristotle, Seneca. Like he's drawing on these people who have no association with the Christian church. And yet Thomas says, actually, though, in a real generous spirit, Thomas is like, actually, we have a lot to learn. And there's things that they said that are really helpful to us as we articulate what it's like to follow the Lord. So I just appreciate, as stodgy as he might come across in terms of prose, it's a pretty capacious, generous sense of theology as an ongoing conversation. And that to me is really moving.
It sounds like a very contemporary kind of concept trapped there in the medieval period. This idea like, yes, we realize our faith exists in a world of potential objections.
Yeah.
We can speak with other people and hear other voices, and we can integrate those things and still actually speak something that is an authoritative truth after dealing with those things. Instead
of seeing the world as something that you need to be antagonistic towards, necessarily so, I think Thomas and many people in our great tradition, they model that the world around us is God's playground too. Mm. And that God is working in the minds and the hearts of people and cultures outside this whatever Christian bubble we might be living in. Mm. And instead of that being terrifying, it done well, it's this excuse to see the Christian life as one, and I think you and I had a conversation in the past, of like, I think the Christian life should be one ready to be surprised, like wonderfully surprised by truths of God wherever we find them. Yeah. And I just think it's kind of a joy to see someone like Thomas, who is so ardently in love with the Lord, because he's so ardently in love with the Lord, he has this generosity of spirit towards the world around him. Mm. He genuinely sees Aristotle as someone who has made him a sharper Christian. Mm-hmm.
What would you say to someone who said, okay, generosity toward the world around us, love it, beautiful, but the problem is that Christians have been too generous to the world around them, have let in too many things, and have gotten confused about what truth is or what faith is?
That can happen too. Right? Like, of course. Like, this is the trick. The Christian life is a pursuit of wisdom, and that wisdom can't happen in isolation. So it matters the community that you keep. Like the most morally important decision is the kinds of friends you decide to follow, to keep in your pocket. What would be a phrase for that?
Orbit.
Jeez, thank you. It is entirely possible and happens all the time, right? Like this kind of like a withered, watered down Christianity where it's just a couple platitudes, right? Of course that could happen. It's not necessary that would have to happen if you'd had a generosity towards the world, but it could. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That's a tough balance.
I get nervous about letting slippery slopes rule the day.
Oh.
Right? Like, oh, well, if you start reading non-Christian books or listening to non-Christian music, it's just a slippery slope towards you just abandoning your faith. Is it? Like, I'm not sure. Like, Florence and the Machine has a song called Shake It Off.
Yeah.
And I saw them perform on Saturday Night Live a long time ago. And it's one of the most...
Are you sure that's not a Taylor Swift song?
Nope.
Shake It Off.
Look at the devil on my back. Isn't that...
I'm not sure.
I don't even know the title. Point is, I had one of the most kind of crystalline spiritual experiences of my life, watching an SNL music guest. The Lord comes to us. The Lord uses the world around us in really beautiful ways. Mm-hmm. And I could choose to cut that off, but I would lose so much opportunity to see the Lord at work everywhere. Mm. And I would just rather, you kind of have to pick your poison of what danger you want to be on the hook for looking out for. I'd rather be on the hook. I'd rather be on the lookout for that danger.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Finish this sentence. The task of theology today is
ongoing. It always is. Listen, it's not, it's the same thing. There's nothing new under the sun. There are new questions, there's new contexts, there's new problems, there's new joys and possibilities. The task of theology is an ongoing work. It is a tradition. Like, Those who came before us did their work. They championed those who came after them to continue that good work. At our best, we learn from those who came before us, and at our best, we set up a better world for those who come after us because of the hard, good theological work we've done. But it's ongoing. It's an ongoing task. It's never done. We're not done. Like, we are not yet who we will one day be. And we're waiting. We're waiting for the glory of, like, to see God in face to face.
Right. We started the conversation talking about church and maybe even this sense that people are leaving church. And I wonder, as we close here, if we could kind of end the conversation on a note like this. For those of us like you who teach and who deal with young people, I mean, you must encounter young people who are on the brink of maybe keeping or losing faith, and the future for them is really, really unsteady. Like, what kinds of principles, like, how do you counsel people in a situation like that, where they're like, look, I just have too many questions. I'm just not sure. I feel overwhelmed. I'm losing it. What's your approach to people who are having a struggle like that?
In most things, I want to play the long game. So it's not my job to save a student. That would be the height of a misunderstanding of who I am and who God is. It's God who saves. My incredibly important job is to be a witness to that God, which means that there can't be this radical disconnect between what I say in class and who I simply am. It is incredibly obvious when someone does not buy what they sell, when they don't live what they're championing other people to do.
Right.
So my own walk with the Lord is part of my teaching. It has to be. When students come to me, not if, when students come to me in these crises of faith, there's a lot of pastoral kind of reading of the tea leaves, right? Of like, okay, what kind of crisis is this? But one of the responses has to be something along the lines of, you're going to be okay. You get to have a crisis of faith. The Lord has not abandoned you. The church will not abandon you. I will not abandon you. Push through. Keep asking your questions. But don't do that in isolation from, like, the very face of God. So ask your questions to God, right? Present them to him. He's not scared of your doubt. There's no question you could ask that is beyond God's incredible love towards you. So it's just reminding people, like, listen, it's okay. Crises happen. Don't do it alone. I think everything's harder alone. So reminding people that they are a part of a community and that they need to stay in community is typically like the pastoral response to that.
Yeah. Professor Hankins, has been really illuminating. And,
Thanks.
Thanks so much for coming in here and talking about these things. So important.
Thank you.